Ra, 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 ra. I beg your pardon, my neighbors and friends. I was caught up in today's subject, music. It is the passion of my soul. I welcome you once more to our house here at Monticello and look forward to your questions on the subject of music. My lifelong interest, I can assure you, as I wrote Nathaniel Burrell, it is my most delightful recreation. It affords us great respite away from the cares of the world, and it is with us our entire lives. I'm happy that Mr. Brandon Dillard is with us again to moderate your questions. And so if you will allow, I will take a chair and enjoy our conversation. Thank you. Well, Mr. Dillard, our first question today.
What kind of music did you grow up with?
I grew up with the music of nature. Never let us underestimate that there is great melody in nature. That provided by the birds, that provided by the winds, and it is no less that provided rather innately in mankind. And just the delight in song. I grew up with song, and that, if you will, accompanied by my favorite instrument, the fiddle. You may call it the violin. It's either one or the other. A fiddle if you enjoy country airs, and violin if you enjoy the more classical. So I grew up with the music of the violin and family song, and I have enjoyed it ever since. Your next question.
So you play the violin?
Oh, I do enjoy the violin. Yes, as I mentioned, it has been with me my entire life. When I was a boy, I had a fiddle. Oh, yes, I fiddled. But as I grew older, I became the more interested in classical compositions. When I went to Williamsburg, I was somewhat bolstered in my desire to learn classical composition because, well, I had made the company for the first time of Mr. Patrick Henry. It was on my way to Williamsburg. It was at Colonel Nathaniel Dandridge plantation in Hanover County. Now, many people do not know that Patrick Henry was proficient upon the fiddle. And as I was taking leave to head on to Williamsburg, I asked him where I might begin lessons. Now, I'm not exaggerating in that stutter. When I was a young boy, I suffered from a stutter. And you know, Patrick Henry replied in his stentorian fashion, "Master Jefferson, proceed to Williamsburg. Begin your lessons with Senor Francis Alberti, and practice diligently every day, and music will help calm your nerves, perhaps provide you an introduction to many a young lady." Well, you never saw a young boy beat a more hasty retreat. I went to Williamsburg, began lessons with Alberti, and I practiced diligently 3 hours a day. And within but a few years, I became renowned as perhaps one of the finest violinists in all of Virginia. Of course, Henry remained a fiddler. But I purchased a fine fiddle, and when I say a fine fiddle, I wish you to know it was the finest of all violins in Williamsburg. It was a Cremona. I made purchase of it in 1768. I brought it back home to Shadwell Farm, where I was living at the time, and continued diligently in practice upon my Cremona. And do you know, most fortunate, as fate would have it, in February of 1770, when Shadwell Farmhouse suffered a great fire, destroying all of my father's library and much of our family furniture, the only thing worthy of being saved, in my opinion, was that violin. And so I continued my practice and artistry upon it. I also made a wager with a cousin of mine, Mr. John Randolph. He was one of the 2 sons of my mother's uncle, Sir John Randolph, the last Attorney General, if you will, of the Crown in Virginia. And John, as the war began, decided that his sentiments were with England. He was a loyalist, but I suggested before he took leave that should he shed his mortal coil in England, well, what about his fine violin? Might I not be able to have that violin? And he said, well, cousin, what if you pass away before me and we do not see one another again? I said, well, John, I will afford you 500 pounds of the finest books in my library. And so it was, we made that wager. But I will tell you sincerely, I was so overcome when he took leave, being my trusted cousin, a good friend as well. I made purchase of his violin and held on to that as well. Now, when I was in France, well, it was there that I decided to purchase a clochette. That is a miniature violin, only about that size and length, half the size in its width. You can play it from the hip, particularly on horseback. The French favorite, and yet my grandchildren say that its tune is not as full, well, quite naturally, not as full as a fine violin. So yes, throughout my entire life, I've enjoyed playing the violin. Your next question.
Susan wants to know, do you still play?
Oh, Susan, do I still play the violin? I wish I could. Lamentably, as Patrick Henry suggested, that a violin would help me make introduction to many a fine lady. Do you know that while I was in France, it was, I believe, September 1786, I was accompanying a lovely lady along the Cour de Rennes, there along the Seine in Paris. Well, a gust of wind blew her scarf from about her neck, and no Virginia gentleman would ever want to see a young lady suffer that. And so I jumped over a balustrade to retrieve the scarf and landed on my right wrist. I fractured it in several places. The pain was excruciating. I had to take up learning to write with my left hand. But that was near the end of my proficiency upon the violin, Susan. I thought that perhaps within years it would mend properly, but unfortunately, a few years after we returned from France, I was out on an afternoon ride and was thrown from my horse and landed on that same wrist. The pain has remained with me throughout my life since. And no, Susan, I have not been able to play that favorite of my instrument, the violin. The next question.
Catherine wants to know, how did you purchase music? Was it available in stores?
Well, Catherine, I can tell you this. As I grew up, we had a family factor, that is, an agent from whom we would solicit many of the goods from Great Britain, nonetheless books and particularly music, sheets of music. So when I was young, I bought many sheets of music, predominantly of the Scottish airs. Now, when I went up to Philadelphia, of course, well, there you had the greater opportunity to purchase a greater variety of music. And so I purchased in kind. And then finally going to France, being witness to many of the concerts, if you will, the duets, the extraordinary symphony and the operas. Well, I sought the purchase of as much music as I possibly could. So that was the method. They sold music just as liberally as one could seek out to purchase books. The next question.
Have you ever performed somewhere special?
Have I ever performed someplace special? Well, when I was a young man, I considered it quite the honor to be invited to the Royal Governor's Palace in Williamsburg. I was a student at the Old Royal College of William and Mary at the time, and my teacher, Dr. William Small, I have referred to him in some of our former sessions. Well, he was a good friend with the Royal Governor, Governor Francis Fauquier. Oh, what a gentleman, Governor Fauquier, well-versed in all of the arts. And so it was that I was invited to the Governor's Palace along with my teacher, Dr. Small, and Mr. George Wythe, the gentleman with whom I later read law. We had the finest repast there because Fauquier, of course, was of French ancestry. So he provided quite the elaborate table, and he was also well accomplished in music. So after our repast and after delightful conversation, we would have a music hour. Myself on the violin, Governor Fauquier as well, Dr. Small upon the spinet, and Mr. With upon the oboe. Do you know that along with the music, we had the greatest conversations, and I heard more good common sense spoken at his table than I declare my entire life besides. We referred to ourselves as a party quarret, a party of four. Now, I should not discount another occasion which I considered just as important in my youth, and that was my courtship of the young lady who became my wife, Mrs. Jefferson. I first met Miss Martha Wales in Williamsburg when I was attending the Old Road College. Oh, she was renowned for her artistry upon the spinet. But unfortunately, she was spoken for by a classmate of mine, Mr. Bathurst Skelton. And Bat and Miss Wales were eventually married. But lamentably, 2 years later, Bat was killed in a carriage accident out on the Jamestown Road. Well, as was customary, a widow would go into seclusion for 2 full years. Well, I remember distinctly, it wasn't but a year and a half. I was riding down the Duke of Gloucester Street in Williamsburg. I heard the most melodious sound of a spinet coming from a parlor window. Well, I recognized the melody. In fact, so did my horse. He perked up his ears, took me immediately to that porch. I jumped off, went up, looked through the window, and there was the graceful form of the widow Skelton seated at the spinet. Well, I knew then she must be coming out of her seclusion. So I made a knock on the door. The servant girl attended. I inquired of her whether the widow Skelton would enjoy Mr. Jefferson to accompany her. Well, the girl went in, returned to the affirmative. She would be delighted. So I ran to my horse satchel. I snatched my violin, went back in, and we began an hour's musicale. It was certain, as I adjourned, that she had accepted my courtship. You know, the same servant girl, as I took leave, when she handed me my hat, said, "Mr. Jefferson, you might be interested to know that during your musicale, I happened to look out the window. And at the time you desisted in your accompaniment, the widow Skelton proceeding in a solo, I saw 2 gentlemen riding down the street. The oddest thing occurred. The ears of the horses perked up, took them swiftly to this porch. They both jumped off. They ran up to the door, ready to knock on that door, when suddenly the music of your violin was heard co-joined with the music of the spinet." She said, "I saw the one gentleman look to the other as he lowered his hand in disgust. We're too late. Jefferson's gotten here before us." That's a true story in variation to all of the Maries, Marias, Mariahs, and Marys. My daughter, Mariah, Mary, enjoyed that version the most. Do you know, we courted for about a year, and we were married on the first of the year, 1772. So that was no less an occasion which I considered very important. Your next question.
Deborah wants to know if you have a favorite song, a favorite composition, something you like to hum or sing.
Well, you caught me as I was coming in singing an air, if you will, a melody from the pantomime of Zamir et Azor. That from Modeste Gretry. I was able to see this opera when I was in Paris, a comic opera. Do you know, Zamir et Azor is simply Beauty and the Beast. So the pantomime, da 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 da. Well, the gentleman would not continue longer. I mentioned that I enjoy many of the Scottish airs. I certainly enjoy the Flowers of Edinburgh, and that is not a comment upon the posies, the flowers, of course, being the young ladies in Edinburgh. And the Lass of Paddy's Mill. Well, again, all of these are favorite melodies of my own. So I thank you for that. My grandchildren say they delight to hear me always with a melody in my heart, humming or whistling an air. And I enjoy them when they engage so to that extent in music. Your next question.
Chester wants to know what instruments your daughters and wife played, and related, Tricia wants to know what type of instrument you're sitting next to right now.
Oh, Well, Chester, firstly, as I made mention earlier, my late wife, Mrs. Jefferson, was quite proficient upon the spinet. And do you know, before we were married, I decided that I would purchase for her a clavichord. Well, as I became very interested in making the purchase and always interested in the latest advance in music, I decided rather than a clavichord, rather than a spinet, rather than even a harpsichord, I would purchase a piano. Oh, now there is a most marvelous instrument, because unlike the harpsichord, that is simply the plucking, if you will, of the strings with simply a standard of tone, well, a piano allows you pianissimo, softly, and forte to play louder. So, Mrs. Jefferson, proficient upon the piano, proficient upon the guitar. I would frequently purchase guitar strings when I was in Williamsburg, and this, of course, was the cittern, otherwise known as an English guitar, not the Spanish variety that has that most beautiful round shape to it. Now, you ask about my granddaughters. Well, they enjoy the guitar as well. And in fact, I purchased for Virginia a very fine cittern, an English guitar, not very long ago. And for my daughters, well, I was very quick to purchase for Martha while we were in France a very fine harpsichord, in fact, a Kirkman. And as you ask, here it is right behind me. This is the Kirkman, James Kirkman, one of the finest music makers all throughout the kingdoms of Europe. Oh, and it has a Celestina stop on it, too. And the Celestina stop, of course, allows it a greater tone, greater fulfillment, if you will, of those notes. So she was delighted with that. Now, of course, I dare say her sister, Mariah, well, she was not content to have her older sister with a fine instrument. So I made a point that when we returned in 1798, that I would purchase for her a very fine clavichord, and that she enjoyed. Now, I will tell you later, 2 years later, in fact, in 1800, I had already become quite interested in the machinations of an Englishman who had come to reside in Philadelphia. In fact, I referred to him earlier in one of our sessions several weeks ago. His name was Hawkins, John Isaac Hawkins. Now, he was the gentleman who created the polygraph, where you might be able to write 2 letters at the same time. Well, do you know, he was also an adept musician, and he created a portable grand, or portable piano. And so in 1800, I ordered one from Mr. Hawkins in Philadelphia. And it was of unusual design because it was upright. It did not have the strings laying, if you will, horizontal, as you see here in the Kirkman. Now, the problem with this upright piano, this portable grand, was the fact that it would easily fall out of tune. And so after about a year or so, I decided to return it to Mr. Hawkins and have, as a consequence, the opportunity to purchase a claviole. In fact, I sent him $300 that he might manufacture one and send it to me. Well, I'm sorry to say that that Mr. Hawkins decided to take leave of our nation. He went back to England, and I never did receive that claviole. I don't know what happened to my $300. But just so long as my daughters and my grandchildren could be satisfied and enjoy music to the extent that I do, and mind you, they enjoy it the more so, particularly as we see improvements in the pianoforte, improvements with astounding music in symphonies and operas and the like. Well, I could not be the happier to know that it began here in our youth, in our family, and particularly here at Monticello. Oh, a lengthy answer, I beg pardon. Your next question.
Do enslaved people at Monticello play music?
The enslaved here at Monticello are perhaps of the most delightful melodies one hears throughout the entire day and during the early evening. They are most adept at music, and particularly upon the violin. Amongst the enslaved, I would consider that Beverly and Madison and Eston Hemmings to be the most accomplished upon the violin. And this, of course, is something that is innate in their particular heritage, the music their families and their ancestors had brought from the kingdoms of Africa and enjoyed ever since. In fact, they have distinctly a manner of making music which is of a particular syncopated sound. Becoming familiar with classical airs and often watching those dance with handkerchiefs in their hands, they provided what we call ragging of those classical airs in a syncopated fashion. This is most uniquely American, in my opinion. So without a question, the enslaved are at the forefront of the advance of music, I believe, in this modern world. Your next question.
Can you tell us a little bit about any memorable music performances you attended while in Europe?
Memorable music performances in Europe is a question that bodes much reflection. Of course, I remember the delightful evening when Mr. and Mrs. Adams, while I was in France, I had arrived while they were still there. They later took leave of Paris to go to London when Mr. Adams was appointed Minister Plenipotentiary of our nation at the court of King George III. But this one particular evening, Mr. and Mrs. Adams, they simply wanted to get away, go out on the town by themselves. But that, of course, would leave their two children, Nabby and John Quincy Adams, at home alone. They were young children at the time. So they asked of me whether I might take those children to the opera. And so it was yes, that young John Quincy Adams, young Abigail, or Nabby, as she was called, and myself, the three of us, we went to see Carmina, the Seculare presentation by Philemon at that time. That was an evening I'll never forget. Also, I had the opportunity to see Gretry. I referred to him earlier. If you will, André Ernest Modeste Gretry. I had the opportunity to see his other well-known opera known as Richard Coeur de Lion, Richard the Lionhearted. Oh, what a magnificent presentation that was. Particularly the song, the hailing song of King Richard. Oh, Richard Montmorency. I beg your pardon again, but I will tell you this from what I've heard. The French, so taken with that particular hailing air, have utilized a song near in imitation of it known as the Marseillaise. Now, when we speak of certain theatrical events, I bore witness to one which was considered very questionable to be presented at the Royal Theatre at Versailles. And that was one of the Figaro plays. Yes, by Pierre Beaumarchais. Pierre Beaumarchais, The Marriage of Figaro, following the Barber of Seville and before Le Maire. I had the opportunity to see that play performed at Versailles. And as you know, it certainly is wont to, grip one with the controversies, inconsistencies, and corruptions within government. And I'll never forget, King Louis XVI did not want that performed, but his wife, the Queen, Marie Antoinette, finally welcomed it at Versailles, and I bore witness to that. So not only, if you will, operas, not only, if you will, musical gatherings, but also plays were something that I shall never forget, having the opportunity to attend while I was minister of our nation to France. Your next question.
Carol wants to know if you have a favorite composer.
A favorite composer. Once again, that's like asking me, do I have a favorite book? I have so many favorite composers. I've mentioned Gretry. I certainly appreciate him. Who could not enjoy Vivaldi? Haydn, of course, Campione, Arcangelo Corelli. I've always enjoyed Corelli's concertos. I like Rameau, Montreal, Many of these composers I want to still, as I have their compositions, provide me hours of great respite and relaxation. So no, I could not name one. Now, someone asked me the other day whether I enjoyed Mozart. Well, I certainly do. They asked me if I have a number of his compositions in my collections. I did. Suffice it to say that he was always a favorite of Mrs. Jefferson's. I look forward to listening to his particular music applied to the marriage of Figaro. Now, as far as the Scottish airs, well, I've often enjoyed Bert Thumat. He is a Scottish composer and has come up with delightful airs. And I will tell you the more so when we talk about composers and musicians, I cannot forget Lieutenant Colonel William Barrows. Do you know he heads our Marine Band? Do you know that I've always enjoyed the Marine Band, so much so that I invited him to play for my first and second inauguration. Lieutenant Colonel Barrows, in order to honor me upon my first inauguration, March the 4th, 1801, created a melody known as Jefferson's March. I was staying at a boarding house in Washington City, Conrad and McMahon on the corner of C and New Jersey Avenue. I had dined there at a round table with many of the workers still endeavoring to complete the building of our nation's Capitol building itself. There, the salt of the earth was gathered around at breakfast, and when I got up, taking my inaugural speech with me, I went to the front door to step out, and there was a crowd of people and the Marine Band. And so they accompanied me as I walked but 2 blocks to the as yet unfinished Capitol building to receive my oath of office. Do you know, from that day forward, I have ever referred to them as the president's own. Your next question.
Pam wants to know if you ever write any music yourself.
I would tell you if I have written music of which I would be pleased and proud of any acclaim. I have dabbled at it. I have sung particular melodies from my own mind, which I have not written down, and when I've endeavored to write them down, I have often wondered how they would be otherwise received. So let me simply say that I'm delighted with the question, and I shall keep my family and all of you, my friends, in the future guessing. Your next question.
Olivia wants to know, do you dance?
Do I dance? Yes. Well, you could not be brought up, if you will, without learning your dance, the dancing lessons. When I was a young boy, even out here on the frontier, I learned my dance. When I went to Williamsburg as a young boy to attend the Old Royal College of William and Mary, yes, I continued to learn my dance. And that is not only to be able to learn a minuet, but also to be able to engage a reel, a good Virginia reel, to the greatest satisfaction. Do you know, as I made mention of the Marine Band, when I was in Washington, one of my greatest delights was to go to see Signor Manfredi. Signor Manfredi would dance upon a tightrope. Yes, I am not making any sort of a fabrication here. Signor Manfredi in Washington City held many beguiled as he danced upon a tightrope, and then he would do a Spanish fandango across eggs. And this is a true story. Now, so concerned that our youth be brought up with an attention to proper dance, an element of exercise and grace, I am considering in the founding of our University of Virginia, a young Italian gentleman by the name of Zerpe, Lee Zerpe, to be hired in order not to only to teach fencing, but also to teach dance. So yes, I danced frequently when I was young, infrequently as I've grown older. The next question.
Don is curious. Do you have a favorite Christmas tune?
Do I have a favorite Christmas tune, Don? I think as you asked me the question, and is there one more than other? Well, the turkey growing fat, of course, is one that I've ever enjoyed. I should not go into that one. Of course, the birth of our Savior, and he came down to earth from heaven. That one, a most pleasing one. So our Christmas melodies, our Christmas songs, which we enjoy but a short time during the year, I've often hoped could be sung throughout the entire year. So I've not mentioned one in particular more than another, but that's like asking me, as we all attended earlier, my favorite composer of my favorite song. So many of the Christmas airs provide us great happiness and great warmth during that most pleasing time of the year. Your next question.
So one final question. Have you ever hosted parties at Monticello that featured music?
I will tell you this. Every gathering at Monticello is a party. And I mean not a party soiree, a party of four, as I made mention when I was young. No, a party of many, many people. We are here in the parlor. Well, many family weddings have occurred here, many family gatherings, visitors who come here enjoy family musicales in the evening. We have family reads, of course, and we want to always carry melody and sing. So yes, I hope you well understood, particularly by your visit here today, that every gathering at Monticello I consider a party. And I hope that you